What's going on, everyone? My name is Rosendo. Welcome back to my channel. We are back with another video, and today's video we are going to talk about progression again because I had an idea. For a while I was kind of struggling with video ideas, and just because I wanted to always kind of do something new, but I already talked about how I want to talk more about concepts on this channel, so that's something that I'm going to be doing. But number two, it kind of dawned on to me that, well, not only do I only, so here's the thing, here's what happened. It kind of dawned on me that every single idea I have in my head really could be a video. And when I say this, I don't mean every single idea, but I mean every single concept or idea or strategy or technique I've used in my composition and songwriting could be a video. And this kind of two things came from that. Number one is, well, let's start with the first one. Number one is there's no shortage of ideas in my head. I mean, you guys see I like to ramble a lot, but there's so many things and ideas and concepts that are just floating around in my head. All I need to do is kind of just pick one and go from there. But like I said, I'm not just picking random ideas. I'm trying to pick techniques and strategies I use in my tracks or my DJ sets or whatever that I could hopefully kind of start, sharing with the world, because even something as simple as an idea that I use in my songwriting could be worth sharing with the world. I don't have to do something super revolutionary every single time, but if I have an idea, if I have a strategy and a technique that I use in my composition, in my arranging, whatever, that I think other people could also utilize, there you go. Easy. Share it with the world through this channel. And number two, the other revelation I kind of had is that there's so many things and ideas that I've already talked about in videos that could really just have their own video, not just because they're super revelationary or groundbreaking, but calling kind of a little bit more attention to detail to these things that I, A, sometimes gloss over in my breakdowns, or B, I don't gloss over and I ramble for a long time, but having a little bit more attention to that specific point could go a long way. And some of the videos that I've made, I think kind of deserve their own video. So that's what we're doing now. Today we're talking about progression, because in my last video, if you guys saw my last video, definitely watch my last video if you haven't already. Up to this point, it's kind of, I think in my eyes, the most important video I've posted. And I think it's kind of a really good starting point for understanding the storytelling abilities of songs, I should say. But the point is, I'm a big fan of progression. I love progression. I love the storytelling ability of arranging your tracks. And in that video, I've kind of briefly mentioned, I went over each track a little bit and I tried to make them quick. The point was to be quick. But I mean, each of those tracks could have deserved their own videos on what the progression means. And in some of them, I have talked about them in those track breakdowns. I've talked about what I did in the progression, but just emphasizing the progression and really drawing attention to the progression of each of those tracks and each example I gave in last video could also be their own video. And yeah, sure, I could have just made last video like 3 hours long and done that, but I want to break it down a little bit more again to give each track, and not necessarily the attention it deserves, but to give the progression of each track the attention it deserves so that you guys can benefit from it. Because I could talk for, a long time about just the progression of, for example, Release. I mean, just watching over that video while I was editing, I thought, man, this track has such great progression, and I probably talked about it quite a bit in the breakdown. I talked about it pretty briefly in that video, but I haven't really dedicated a full video just talking about the progression. So that's what we're going to do, not with Release today. We're going to be talking about, if you saw last video, the most standard bread and butter form of progression that I talked about last video, that again, I probably only gave a minute or two in Progress and then a minute in Express, breaking it down, because like I said, it was the most standard form of progression that I don't even think is worth breaking down. But I mean, if I'm dedicating an entire video to it, I think it would be worth it, because in that video I had a million other things I want to talk about. And I thought standard form, boring progression, whatever, let's give it 30 seconds. But here I'm going to take a full video breaking down the most standard form of progression. Again, I think this will be a short video. I'm not making any promises. Last video, all things considered, ended up being pretty short, 30 minutes. I think this one will be short as well, but the fact that I've already rambled for this long in the intro is probably not a good sign. But that's not the point. Today's video, we are talking about progression. We are talking about the most standard form of progression that I talked about last video, and we're going to jump pretty quickly into the DAW. But real quick before we do that, I want to mention that standard form of progression, just give you kind of a framework of what it is so you know what we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to talk about how I applied it in two tracks. Express and actually Journey Beyond, because I had just talked about Journey Beyond in my rhythmic ambiguity video, so I didn't really want to talk about it again in the next video, but I think that's going to be a good example of a track that utilizes the most standard form of progression. So today we're taking a look at Express and Journey Beyond, talking about the most standard form of progression. I talked a little bit about in Progress, but I might dedicate another video to that, because as I mentioned, Progress does something a little bit more unique, which kind of blends together a ton of concepts. Specifically, actually there's a lot of concepts in there that it blends together that I might have to just wait for a while until I talk more about those. And the other thing was, and release. And release also does this, but release, like I said, has actually really good progression that I want to probably take a whole video just breaking down that track to talk about emphasis of the rhythm. And that track actually varied the rhythm quite a bit. It's not about the drums. And the tracks we're talking about today, which are Express and Journey Beyond, a lot of the progression comes from the drums. And in the way that I'm going to talk about it, Journey Beyond gets a little bit more, kind of more creative in its storytelling, but the standard form of progression is there, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to be looking at those two tracks, talking about the most standard form of progression, which, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about right now. So if you saw last video, in my eyes, the most standard form of progression in your tracks is this, where let's call them verses. On my tracks, a lot of them are instrumental, so there's no vocals to them. But let's take your track. Let's imagine there are vocals, or if there are no vocals, it doesn't matter. The first section before the drop, this is electronic music, but I'm sure this applies. This actually does apply to pretty much all genres, unless you're making like classical. This applies to most genres, especially most modern music genres. The most standard form of progression is this. In your track, in the first section of your track, in the first verse, you have no drums, then the drop or the chorus, and in the second verse, you add your drums. That is the most basic form of progression that we're going to be taking a look at today through, as I mentioned, Express and Journey Beyond. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and without further ado, let's hop into FL Studio. Sorry to interrupt, but before we hop into FL Studio, real quick, I just want to make one clarification because I just finished recording my explanation of the progression in those two tracks. So this is after I just recorded that. But I wanted to add a real quick clarification before we actually do that, now that I've recorded that, which is, I know I've said that the simple form of progression is no drums in the first verse and then drums in the second verse. But just quickly to clarify, I don't mean no drums whatsoever, because almost always there will be drums in the first verse. When I say no drums, I mean no defining drums. You don't have the drums that really define what your track is, what genre it is, or what the track is known for. Essentially, you don't have a very concrete, fixed sense of rhythm that you introduce in your track through whatever drums you like. Whatever concrete or fixed sense of rhythm you introduce in your track, presumably in the drop or in the chorus or whatever, you don't have that in the first verse. So you could have drums in the first verse, you can have them do whatever you want, but if in the drop you introduce a very fixed sense of rhythm, whether it's just a kick on every beat or a kick on every beat with a snare on the 2s and the 4s, or whatever it is, whatever those defining drums are that you introduce in the drop, you do not have those in verse number 1, and you do have them, or at least parts of them, in verse number 2. That's what I mean when I say no drums verse 1, drums verse number 2. I wanted to clarify that just so you guys can have a little bit more context going into the breakdowns. So now we can get into FL Studio. All right, we are back in FL Studio, this time taking a look at Express. I know we looked at this track last time if you saw the last video, but like I said, I can pretty much dedicate a whole video just talking about these concepts. I could probably pick any one of these things in this track and dedicate a whole video talking about that, but that's not what we're doing today. Today we're talking about the progression, and not just the progression, because again, I could dedicate a whole video talking about the progression of Express specifically, but we're talking about the most standard form of progression and how that is used in Express. But like I said, I still think this will be a short video because there's really not much to say. Like I said, no drums. We'll talk about that, but that's really all we're going over today. So let's talk about Express here. Now, ignoring the intro of Express, because if we're kind of dividing the track into sections, and this is something that we can talk about here, because it does matter. It does play a role when it comes to the progression of your track. If we're talking dividing a track into sections, let's take Express as a perfect example. Let's divide it into intro, verse, build up, drop, verse, build up. Well, actually, this is a little bit of a longer verse. So the whole verse would be this, build up, drop, outro. So that's what we're looking at. Let's take this track and let's ignore the intro and the outro. Let's pretend the intro and the outro aren't there because they're there just for out of convention, just kind of have the intro and outro of the track. It introduces the track as well. There's intention behind it. I'm sure I talked in the video, my breakdown video, why I like this intro. Rides on every other beat, introduces some rhythmic ambiguity, contrasted with the faster hi-hats. The BPM is kind of up in the air, but you introduce this to make it introduce that you're doing a drum and bass track because it's the first drum and bass track ever made. Blah, 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 emotional mode, blah, 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 a bunch of other stuff that don't really matter that I probably talked about in the video. Again, I can make a whole video talking about why I made this as the intro. It wouldn't be a 60-minute video, but I can make a 10-20 minute video, maybe not 20. I can make a 10-minute video why I made this the intro. That's intention, people. Make your tracks, make every decision with intention. But we're not talking about that. Anyways, I'm rambling again. But I am glad I mentioned that because again, your track should to some extent exist in sections. So one more time, this will be worth going over. I'll do this quickly. Intro, verse, build up, drop, verse, build up, drop, outro. Right now we are concerned with not the intro, not the outro, verse, build up, drop, verse, and then what happens over here doesn't really matter. So most standard form of progression. Let's start with verse number 1. Again, you can call them verses or breakdowns because there's no lyrics, but let's take verse number 1 right here. This is essentially, intro aside, how the track starts. And this is Express if you haven't heard this track already. But notably, again, there are no drums right here. We're going to introduce some drums over here, but that's the exception to the drum and bass drums. So we'll talk about what that means. But this is your intro, no drums at all. You get a ride on every other beat. Still a little bit more rhythmically ambiguous because the ride is on every other beat, so the rhythm still feels halved, which puts us at what, 86 BPM, 87 BPM. And then we get our build up. But we're comparing verses here. The build up is pretty standard, kick on every beat. We introduce a little bit of a faster rhythm, but we get that anyways over here, so that doesn't matter. But let's talk about the verses specifically because we have verse 1, drop, verse 2. So in verse 1, as I mentioned, we start with 0 drums. And then we get the drums a little bit, right? We get a hi-hat, we get a ride. That just introduce a little bit of, percussion, a little bit of movement, a little bit of shimmer, I might even say. But again, it still keeps it rhythmically ambiguous because with the ride on every other beat, it still feels like we're in what we're going to call halftime, even though if you're listening to this track, it'll feel like standard time. Which is again, what, 87 BPM if I did my math right. It feels like you're at 87 BPM more or less. If you know this is a drum, and bass track because you heard the intro. But as far as the feel goes, it feels like you're in 87 BPM, and you haven't really gotten fixed on the drum and bass drums that you know and love. Because this is a drum and bass track, you already heard the intro. But in the first verse, we haven't introduced the drum and bass drums that are so kind of so characteristic of the genre. We get this instead. Anyways, after that, as I mentioned, this is verse 1. Verse 1, no drums, and when we do get drums, they're drums that are not characteristic / defining of the drum and bass genre. Then we get our build up. Again, it's a harsh track, but we don't care about that right now. Build up, and then we get our drop. And in the drop, we get our kind of recognizable drum and bass drums, kick and snare, or kick and snare pattern. We still get the hi-hats and the tambourine over here and the rides. I guess no hi-hats. We have the tambourine and the ride over here. So we get, a full kind of a arrangement of drums. But what we do after that is, well, let's take this. The drop kind of slows down a little bit. Drum and bass drums are still hitting. And then we take the drum and bass drums away. Got a nice little reverse here. Extra tambourine hit, looks like it. And now we are on verse 2. And as discussed, verse 2 has the drum and bass drums. This is progression in its simplest forms. If you don't believe me, listen to some tracks that do this. There are plenty of tracks out there. 30-second break while I think of some tracks. I'll give 3 examples. Now, I'm sure I could come up with better examples because usually when I give examples, I like to kind of choose very, very recognizable songs. Kind of, the most popular songs in EDM or just even outside of EDM. But that would take a lot of time and it's not that important. It's really not. Although it is. Maybe in the future I'm going to have a list of these tracks so I can pull them off the top of my head. But let's give 4 examples. Number 1 is Beautiful Now by Zedd. Great example. A little bit more upbeat track, but again, starts, vocals, has the verse, no drums, hits the drop, drums in the second verse. Reverie by Illenium, one of my favorite tracks. Very good storytelling, has a little bit more of a standard progression that way with very, very atmospheric and vague first verse, drop, and then drums in the second verse. And then even if you take a look at Alive by Cruella and Enjoy the Ride by Cruella, they do the exact same things and it introduces some nice progression in their tracks. In Alive, actually, they introduced the kick earlier in the first verse, they introduced the kick later in the first verse, but the vocals start with no kick and no drums at all. Then they introduce the kick, and then the drop hits, and the next verse starts with a kick. They do the same thing in Enjoy the Ride, where there's no drums, but there actually is a filtered kick there, then the drop, and then an unfiltered kick in the second verse. Again, very standard form of progression. And that's what we are doing here. We are starting the first verse with no drums. Sure, nothing here. Sure, you get a little bit of something here. And then in the second verse, right after the drop, we have the drums right away. Again, most standard form of progression. This is something you can and should utilize in your tracks, which is why I'm a fan of rhythmic ambiguity. We have an intro here, but let's ignore the intro. This would be considered right here in the verses rhythmic ambiguity. If you want to use the most standard form of progression in your tracks, have the first verse or section have no drums, or at least no fixed sense of drums. For example, if we just had a kick here, it might make sense. If we just had a snare here, it might make sense, but we don't have the very recognizable drum and bass drums that define the genre. We don't have these in the first verse. Then the progression kind of goes out the window, and we don't want that. But that's enough about Express, because now we're taking a look at Journey Beyond, which does something very similar. Now, we're going to kind of break this down into sections again, although this is such a long track, and we're going to call to attention one specific thing that we do here that is different. But again, let's break this track into sections again. Because again, up to this point, it should be the longest track I released. I don't think Understanding broke it. If you're watching this before June 20th, it's the longest track I've released. And up to this point of recording, it should be the longest track I've released. But by June 20th, it will not be. By sometime in September, it will still not be. Will definitely still not be. It'll actually be placed third. But we're taking a look at this now. So let's break this track into sections again. Again, it'll be a lot easier if you guys know the track. So if you haven't listened to it, go check it out. I just listened to this track again not that long ago, and man, it's so good. But let's see. We have this whole thing right here is going to be our intro. So it's a 1 minute intro, and then we start with verse number 1. So we have an intro. Well, this is pretty loud. We have an intro here. We have an intro. We do some other things, we build it up, we do a bunch of things, and the track comes down. As far as we're concerned, verse number 1 starts right here. We have verse number 1, build up, drop. We bring it back down a little bit, but then we go into verse number 2. Then we'll get to this. This is more of a breakdown. And then drop, build up, drop again. And then this is what we're going to call the outro. But again, as far as we're concerned, we have verse number 1, build up and drop. Verse number 2. This is what we are looking at. So let's start with verse number 1. What do we have here? Kick on every other beat. This is where the rhythm matters, because I like to say no drums, but I guess I should clarify when I say that, I don't mean no drums at all. Again, when I say no drums, I mean no drums that define the track. Because here with a kick and a snap, kick on every other beat, and a slightly soft snap that is not being played in the drop, and again, really soft shaker loop right here. Plus again, these soft pads, everything all over here. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the rhythm, because again, the rhythm is slow here with a kick on every beat and a really soft snap. I don't know why my mind was blanking for a bit. And then where do we go from there? Into the build up. Now we introduce the snare that we're going to have for this track. We get the drop, which still has to kick on every other beat, but with the kick snare, it's still hitting kind of a quarter note rhythm. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what we're listening to here. Here, the quarter note rhythm isn't quite as defined because the snap is just so soft that we mostly just listen to the kick. Plus, with all the droniness of the atmosphere, the rhythm is not really as fixed as it will be, in the drop and later. So we take the drop. Definitely quarter note rhythm there, especially with the side chain, with the bass that I really, really like. It's very quarter notey. We feel the quarter note with the side chain and everything. That's where the main rhythm kicks in. We drop the track down a little bit because the whole track is meant to be a journey. But in verse number 2, we get that fixed quarter note with the kick on every beat. This is a very, again, bread and butter example of progression. Although I'm glad I broke this down and I'm glad I clarified that, because again, when I say no drums, I don't mean no drums at all. And it's clear in the examples I gave last time that there are drums. But when I say no drums, I don't mean no drums at all. I simply mean we don't have the drums that really define and characterize the track, which here would be kind of this heavy kick with, some, the kick. It's really the kick. It's the emphasis on the quarter note. Again, it's about the rhythm, not necessarily what makes up the rhythm. It's about the rhythm. Here, the rhythm is still kind of all up in the air. Not as ambiguous because you kind of know what BPM you're at and you're getting a little bit of a fix of the rhythm. But with the droniness of the atmospheres and with the kick on every other beat and such a soft snare, it's not quite as concrete. Versus here, it's very, very, very concrete. So that's what we're looking at. Verse number 1, no fixed sense of rhythm, no characterizing, no defining drums. Very atmospheric. Verse number 2, powerful. Plus we keep the sidechain, right? We keep presumably, we actually get, this bass over here. We keep the sidechain over here going. You'll see right here, the synth bus keeps the sidechain on. So the rhythm is really, really there. We do some fun stuff, break it down a little bit more. Now the interesting thing about this track is because this track is meant to be more of a journey, maybe I could make a whole video probably on, I could make a video, I really could, and I might make a whole video just on the progression of this track. But because the whole track is meant to be like a journey, and this is where the storytelling ability of drums, quick ramble here. This is where the storytelling ability of drums really, really plays a role, because in the intro, now we're not ignoring the intro, in the intro we have no drums at all. Then we introduce the drums. Well, actually, we got kind of these crashes right here. Then we introduce the drums. Then after the drop, we get the same crashes. But that's not the point. The point is in the storytelling ability of the track, when we get the drums again. And over here, when we take them away, it really introduces a whole new kind of nuance to the track. It introduces the storytelling really, really well. It takes you on that journey with you. And then we get the build up again with the 1/8. We got with the quarter note snare and the quarter note sidechain emphasis. Pretty standard build up into a drop that goes into halftime. So also a distinct rhythm to what we had in the first drop, and the characterizing kind of rhythm of the track. We get a halftime drop that definitely feels slower. And then no drums again for the outro. That's pretty nice progression right there. That's where drums can really contribute to the storytelling, when you really not just get creative, but it's when you really decide where they are and where they aren't, and what is where they are and what is not where they are not. In this case, the snap is over here, but it's not over here. The snare, blah, blah, blah. Snare's still not over here though. Things like that. But again, really nice storytelling, especially a perfect example of is in the second verse when you have all this. Then you drop the drums, especially with those cinematic drums. Very nice storytelling ability. But the main takeaway we're looking at is verse number 1, no concrete / defining sense of rhythm. Verse number 2, concrete / defining sense of rhythm, especially in the context where that concrete / defining sense of rhythm is what we introduce in the drop. Very fixed emphasis on the quarter note sidechain. Second verse, quarter note sidechain is still there and kick on every beat. So we get that quarter note rhythm that we really, really like. Shakers are still there, but that's what we're looking for here. All right, and that is about all I have for you. Again, I just recorded that clarification, so I hope this video makes a little bit more sense. But yeah, that's Express. That is Journey Beyond. That is the most simple form of progression where you take no drums. I'm still going to say that because you don't really have the fixed sense of drums. No drums, drop, and then drums in the verse number 2. But again, it's about not having the track defining drums in verse number 1. So no track defining drums, verse number 1, drop, verse number 2 with the track defining drums. But again, for the sake of the argument, we're going to say verse number 1, no drums, verse number 1, no drums, drop with the drop drums, verse number 2, drums with presumably the drop drums or some element of the drop drums, whatever carries the rhythm that you had in the drop. Again, long story short, verse number 1, no drums, drop, verse number 2, drums. That is the most standard, basic, bread and butter, all reliable form of progression. And that is the most standard all reliable form of progression. But anyways, that is all I have for you. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to leave any questions or comments you guys may have in the comments and I'll answer them. Don't forget to share a little bit about your tracks. If you use a strategy, if you've recognized a strategy, if you say, hey, maybe I've never thought about tracks that way. If you say, oh yeah, I know, there are tons of tracks that do that. I really like tracks that do that. Or if you don't like tracks that do that, let me know if you're going to use this in your tracks. Let me know if you have different ways you might approach the progression in your tracks if it's not the strategy. But if it's other other strategies. Let me know if you like it when certain genres do this, or if you don't like when other genres do this. Let me know if there are any tracks that you really like that do this. Hopefully recognizable tracks so that most people in the comments can recognize them. But again, if you have any favorite tracks that use this strategy, let me know. Drop them in the comments. We can all check them out. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. But other than that, that is all I have for you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.